Now I would like to explain how this present system for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage in Japan came into being by briefly touching on its historical background. The initial law for protection of cultural properties was enacted in 1950. From this point, Japan came to recognize the cultural product that are intangible as cultural properties. And it was from this point on that the term of intangible cultural properties entered the vocabulary. However, the concept of intangible cultural properties at this time was a little different from that of today. In that element being in danger of extinction was extremely important in that day. In other words, the concept of safeguarding against a critical situation, protecting intangible cultural properties, which if left unprotected, would be lost forever, lay at the foundation of the concept of intangible cultural properties in initial stage of the legal system of protection. So in the version of the law that followed in 1954, the concept intangible cultural properties was altered somewhat. And this reversion gave rise to the movement by the government to designate traditional performing arts and craft techniques with particularly high artistic or historic value as important intangible cultural properties. At this stage, the concept of being in danger of extinction may have been in the background, but it was no longer in the fore. With adoption of the designation system in 1955, the concept of the government designating the protecting what is of historic or what is of artistic value to Japan became prevalent. Well, another major reversion to the law was made later in 1975. With this reversion, the concept of intangible folk cultural properties was added to the scope of the law in addition to the conventional intangible cultural properties. At that time, this type encompassed manners and customs of folk performing arts. It did not include the folk techniques yet. The basic thinking behind this reversion was to protect the folk materials, which are essential in expressing the change in the Japanese people's mode of life. As intangible folk cultural properties and to designate the most important of these as important intangible folk cultural properties. Furthermore, the reversion to the law in 1975 also gave rise to concept of protecting the techniques for the conservation cultural properties, which was mentioned earlier. The concept behind this was that traditional techniques were necessary and indispensable for the restoration, preservation, and handed down of all cultural properties. Through this system, such techniques would be selected as a conservation techniques for the cultural properties, and the selected conservation techniques would become subject to various measures for safeguarding by the government. I have just outlined the various types of cultural properties as a whole. Intangible cultural properties currently include the traditional performing arts and craft techniques. And intangible folk cultural properties include manners and customs, folk performing arts, and newly added traditional folk techniques. And the conservation techniques for the cultural properties include the traditional techniques necessary for the restoration and transmission of cultural properties. Next, I would like to briefly explain actual procedures taken in designating the important cultural heritage, recognizing their holders or selecting them. The first stage, preliminary research. The designation, selection of the intangible cultural heritage and the recognition of holders and holders groups are predicated on the conducting of sufficient preliminary surveys. As a number of applicable intangible cultural properties and techniques for preserving the cultural properties comparatively limited. These surveys are primarily conducted by the researchers in Agency for Cultural Affairs. In these cases, it is important to adequately a certain research trend by the relevant academic societies. The research result of researchers related to the applicable field and other type of information. On the other hand, there are numerous applicable intangible folk cultural properties existing nationwide. I cannot count the correct numbers, but it is almost about 50,000 folk cultures in Japan. It would be difficult to have the sufficient basic survey conducted by the only researchers working in Agency for Cultural Affairs, of which there are only 6 researchers in charge of intangible folk cultural properties in the government. However, most intangible folk cultural properties have already been designated at the prefecture or municipal level prior to being designated at the national level, which means that survey required for the certain degrees of basic value assessments have already been made. In many cases, survey report and audio-visual recording are also available. Accordingly, survey at the national level are conducted on the basis of these existing survey results. So, second step, selection of candidates for inscription on the list. A candidate is chosen according to the following step based on the preliminary survey. The first, a draft proposal produced by the Secretariat. Sorry, only words. And second, approved by the Agency for Cultural Affairs. And third, approved by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. And third stage is final decision. The Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, and Science and Technology submit the advisability of including the candidate in inventory or national list to the Culture Council. While the Culture Council then investigates this submission through the cultural properties subcommittee. Cultural properties subcommittee is composed by the expert and a professor in a university and so on. A request to engage in deliberation is further issued to an expert panel comprising the specialist researchers in the given field. Matters that have been carefully discussed by this panel of experts are reported to the cultural properties subcommittees and to the Culture Council finally. The result of this process are submitted to the ministers. Based on this result, the government publicly announces the fact of designation and recognition or selection. Well, next I would like to touch upon the method of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in Japan. It should be noted that the method of safeguarding varies from object to object. First of all, about the method for the safeguarding of intangible cultural properties and conservation techniques for cultural properties. As mentioned earlier, these two quite similar in that in both techniques are designated or selected, and that individual or groups holding these techniques are recognized by the government. Consequently, the methods for their protection are also similar to a certain extent. So basically, recognized individuals or groups receive the support from the government in the form of government subsidies. To individual holders, the national subsidies, a holder of important intangible properties, 2 million yen per year, and holders conservation techniques for the cultural properties, 1,106,000 yen per year is granted to help them develop their own skill or techniques and for the training successes. Recognized organizations are granted partial national support for their expense training successes. So moreover, successor training programs are held at national theaters for traditional performing arts and recognized cultural properties by the government. like kabuki, ningyo jōruri bunraku, and nogaku. The government subsidies such programs, and from an overall perspective, it may be said that the government runs as well as fund these successor training programs. So furthermore, although limited mostly to the field of craft techniques so far, the government also directly document the techniques. With regard to performing arts, documenting is left mostly to the national theaters, which are both the performing arts recording organization for the performing arts. And method for the safeguarding of folk culture properties, on the other hand, differ significantly from the above-mentioned method. In the case of folk culture properties, people who transmit festival manners and customs of folk performing arts and folk techniques in each region are generally not individual, but groups or communities which have been formed specifically for the purpose of their protection. The government basically provides support in the form of subsidies to such group or to the various safeguarding programs conducted by the municipalities in which these groups reside. So safeguarding programs include first and foremost successor training program. Since folk culture properties are transmitted from the person to person. Furthermore, even though there are intangible folk culture properties, various tangible objects are required for their preservation. For example, costume, various tools used in festival, and musical instrument are needed. The government provides subsidies to the program to make any of above or other project newly or to repair visual the one in use necessary. Moreover, when there are need to prepare the visual image or pamphlet introducing the folk culture properties, the government will provide a subsidy toward the expense paid in producing these pamphlet and visual image that convey the value of folk culture properties to a wide audience. Moreover, we must remember that such folk culture properties cannot be protected by the holders of performing arts, folk techniques, or manners and customs alone. Wide dissemination of its value to the residents of the surrounding areas or to the general public plays a crucial role in safeguarding of such folk culture properties. For this reason, the government supports the various workshops and other dissemination programs and seminars intended to familiarize the public with the value of these folk culture properties. So far, I have spoken briefly on the system of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in Japan. Okay, conclusion. So Japan has had some experience in these matters. And this history was a continuation of problem generating and its correspondence. Of course, Since the environment which surrounding ICH in each country differs, it may be rare for this experience to be directly helpful. If ICH is at all a symbol of the diversity of the culture in the world, the safeguarding measures for ICH should also be valid. So I'm very happy if my poor presentation could be helpful for you. Thank you for your attention.